Support comes from St. Louis Public Library Foundation, helping the library serve children and their families with programs and services needed to become lifelong readers. More information about the foundation is at slpl.org.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. I want to rewind to election night inside a hotel ballroom in St. Louis. It's late in the evening, and it is abundantly clear that Donald Trump will return as president and that Missouri Republicans will dominate in statewide and legislative elections.
Tonight, we send the resounding message of where power lies.
Yet the crowd here isn't celebrating either of those things. People like Luz Henriquez of the ACLU of Missouri are expressing unbridled joy over the passage of Amendment 3, a measure that would end the state's abortion ban.
Despite the actions of our out-of-touch politicians, together we persisted through each and every obstacle that they threw our way.
Amendment 3's victory is rekindling perhaps the most difficult question in Missouri politics. Why do voters back initiative petitions seen as progressive or left of center, while also electing Republicans up and down the ballot? To be upfront, if you're listening because you want a simple one-sentence answer, you're going to be disappointed. I can't peer into the subconscious of every Missourian who split their ticket. But I did get insight from some who did, including St. Louisan Umar Lee.
Politics is not a love affair. It is dating, a temporary marriage, and sometimes it's a one-night stand.
I've known Lee since I moved to St. Louis in the early 2010s. In 2014, Lee was in Ferguson protesting a police officer shooting and killing Michael Brown. And in between traveling around the world and sounding off on the state of boxing, Lee is a public supporter of Democrats running for municipal posts in St. Louis. This year, though, Lee ended up voting for Republicans like Governor-elect Mike Kehoe. He doesn't agree with Kehoe on some issues, especially since he also voted to legalize abortion and raise the minimum wage. But after going to an event supporting the GOP official's candidacy, he felt like he was the right person to be the state's governor.
When I look at the leadership of, or the punditry, or the thought makers and the academics that are influencing the Democratic Party, I don't see people that I feel I have a common worldview with, that I have a common lived experience with. I would, the George W. Bush line, could you sit down and drink a beer with them? I don't know if I could sit down and eat avocado toast with them, even though I would never eat avocado toast under any circumstances. But, there's a cultural divide that has emerged.
Another voter, Tim Davis, voted in a similar manner. He lives in Shelby County, which is about 160 miles northwest of St. Louis. He grew up in a family that tended to back Democratic candidates, and he doesn't think that abortion should be illegal or that the state government should crack down on labor unions. But Davis liked Kehoe's agricultural policy stances, and since agriculture is important to Davis, he joined more than 80% of Shelby County's voters in backing Kehoe.
Voters are very complex, and we have a bunch of different reasons for thinking the things that we do, and I know that even my wife and I don't agree on every single thing, and we're from the same town, and we've had some of the same experiences, but we're going to differ on a few things.
Some Democrats have been befuddled by these types of decisions, especially since people like Kehoe oppose things like abortion rights and higher minimum wages. But Kansas City resident Molly Bruns isn't really surprised by this phenomenon. Bruns grew up in Cole County, which often votes for GOP candidates, but is more receptive sometimes to left-of-center issues. For instance, residents there backed Kehoe with 71% of the vote, hardly surprising given that the governor-elect lives in Jefferson City. But 43% of Cole County residents voted yes on Amendment 3. Bruns says that many mid-Missouri voters tend to vote Republican because that's how their friends or family vote. But that doesn't mean that those people agree with the party on everything.
Something that is so core to Missourians as a whole is we hold tradition very close, especially in mid-Missouri and rural Missouri areas. With that also being said, those are an incredibly hardworking group of people. And a lot of times they don't have the time to educate themselves on what is actually going into these policies. A lot of times what's going into these party policies.
That's Molly Bruns of Kansas City. And joining me now in studio to delve into Missouri's fascinating and contradictory voting behavior is John Hancock. Hancock is a former Republican state lawmaker from St. Louis County who has worked for several decades to help GOP candidates and to pass ballot initiatives. John, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Great to be here, Jason.
You've been involved in Missouri politics for decades. Have the voting patterns in terms of candidates and ballot initiatives always defied stereotypes or partisan patterns?
Well, they certainly have changed over the course of my career. The state's fundamentally a different place now politically, certainly from a partisan standpoint. And, whether you've had the divergent, public policy votes that take place on ballot initiatives versus the makeup of the General Assembly, I think that's fairly of recent vintage.
Yeah, and let's talk about it a little bit more than just abortion, because that's obviously getting a lot of attention now because it happened like 3 weeks ago. But Missourians have also backed legalized marijuana, Medicaid expansion, and at least 3 minimum wage increases since 2006. They've also rejected efforts to institute right to work, which bars unions and employers from requiring workers to pay dues. Why do you think that those measures in particular have been successful?
Well, I think one of the basic, most simple explanation is that the prevailing side of that has massively outspent the anti-side. And I think that's just a fundamental of American politics, that when the spending on a proposition is so disproportionate, the team that spends usually prevails. So I think that's part of it. And I also think that the state voters as a whole are less economically, fiscally conservative than they are culturally conservative.
Why do you think that no sides, opposition campaigns, for the most part, have such a difficult time raising money? Because the anti-side for the Medicaid expansion raised almost no money. The anti-side for the marijuana initiative raised very little money. And while the anti-side for the abortion initiative ended up raising some money, it was dwarfed by the pro side, which raised around or over $30 million.
Yeah, well, usually on the pro side of these things, you've got an industry or a group of people that are going to financially benefit. You look at marijuana, certainly even look at abortion. The groups that are going to financially benefit, they plow the money in. And the no side typically are folks that are concerned citizens, but there's not a moneyed interest really propelling them. The pro-life folks were able to raise, $3-4 million, but they were, outspent 10 to 1. So I think that explains a lot, but I do think the state would be inaccurate to say it's a conservative bastion of voters, because they certainly haven't voted that way on the issues you highlighted.
I spoke with Sean Sonker Nicholson, who, like you, has worked on initiative petition campaigns. And he said ballot items often have major structural advantages compared to candidates. Here is Sean explaining that further.
By the time ballot measures ever get to a voter's ballot, they are usually pretty darn popular before they get very far in the process at all. Ballot measures happen when there is a failure of normal legislative processes to produce an outcome that is in line with what voters want. And when legislators either fail in their responsibilities or choose to ignore what the voters are asking for, that's what creates the pressure and the voter support and the desire to do it. So on one hand, it's worth noting that ballot measures start as really popular ideas in general. Like it's hard enough to do. It takes enough work to do. It takes enough resources you have to raise from people and dollars and everything else that just unpopular ideas don't make it to the ballot very often.
That was Sean Sonker Nicholson, a Democratic political consultant. What do you think about Sean's comments?
Well, I think you don't go to the ballot if you think you have no chance of winning. So you're going to take an initiative, a policy position that you believe has a strong chance of passage, and then you plow a bunch of money into it, and the messaging and the polling and all of the things involved in running any campaign. And they're, more often than not, when one side's spending and the other side's not, the side that's spending is going to prevail.
I talked with a number of voters for this segment, including Maryland Heights resident Christopher Spears. Now, Spears was not a split ticket voter. He voted for Democratic candidates and things like the minimum wage increase and the abortion legalization measure. But he had an interesting theory about why Amendment 3 found favor this year, primarily because, in his view, voters can often connect with the issue of abortion in ways that transcend politics.
These are, very specific reasons that are very emotional. These are things that hit at the heart and not at the brain. And I think that's the kind of thing that cuts through polarization to an extent today. It's also interesting that you're seeing such narrowing margins outstate. Certainly, that it passing in St. Charles was a surprise to me, and coming close in Jeffco was also a surprise.
That was Christopher Spears, a resident of Maryland Heights who voted for Amendment 3. And what Chris was talking about there is that Amendment 3 passed in St. Charles County, and it failed in Jeffco, but it came kind of close to pass.
Yeah, right.
And given that both of those places are seen as GOP strongholds, do you think that performances like that showcase that abortion rights is maybe not as partisan as people assume?
I think that's probably right. Abortion is a unique issue. I mean, all of these other issues we've talked about, gaming, minimum wage, Medicaid expansion, those are more traditional. The abortion issue first of all, it's been with us forever, and 51 years beyond Roe v. Wade. And people have strong feelings about it, and many of those feelings are rooted in religious faith for a lot of people. And I would like to see us have a dialogue on abortion. We've not had this, but my personal belief is that between conception and live birth, I think there's a general consensus in the population that at some point that babies has rights that ought to be protected by the state. Now, we're going to have wild disagreements on what point in that line between conception and birth those protections should come into place. But that's the place where we ought to start having the conversation, societally having the conversation, because I do think there's general consensus that baby deserves some protection. And, the whole debate we just went through with Amendment 3, we didn't have that conversation. And we can't have it now because it's in the state constitution, so the legislature can't have that conversation.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because after Amendment 3 passed, and I said abortion has been legalized in Missouri, by the time this airs, it still won't be legal, but it will be legal on December 5th. A lot of the reaction was, well, no, the legislature is just going to overturn it, but it's much harder to do that. They would have to put something else on the ballot.
Right.
And one of the people who has brought that up as a possibility is Senate President Pro Tem Cindy O'Laughlin, who believes that the debate over abortion access in Missouri is not over yet.
I think that you can value life and treasure life and feel that taking any unborn innocent child's life is wrong, while at the same time understanding that there are people who just feel this is my body and I should be able to make the final decision. So, it is a difficult topic. It isn't that I don't understand both sides. I've had 4 children. There's just no way that I could take a life.
That was incoming Senate President Pro Tem Cindy O'Laughlin, a Republican from Shelbina. On the one hand, you have abortion rights proponents saying this issue has been decided by the people, and Republicans that want to put something else on the ballot are ignoring that message. On the other hand, you hear people like Cindy O'Laughlin, who clearly have strong convictions against abortion rights, basically saying, there's no way we're not going to respond to this. those are two ideas there's no compromise there. They seem like completely in conflict.
Well, in some respects, the issue now, in light of the Dobbs decision, and the Dobbs decision did what pro-lifers wanted it to do. I don't know that pro-lifers had effectively engaged the culture conversation over abortion well. They'd been so focused on legislating, no abortions for any reason, blah, 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 rather than trying to persuade and move and have a conversation about the issue. So I expect that we're, in some respects, back to where we were in the 1970s and 80s, where you're going to see some incremental attempts to rein in the unfettered access to abortion as birth control, for example. And I think that's going to be an ongoing issue that's going to be relevant and top of mind for years to come.
I think that one of the noticeable things that I saw in the Amendment 3 campaign on the anti-side was there wasn't much attempt to defend the law that was being repealed. There was a lot of efforts to say Amendment 3 will do this or it'll do that, but nobody that I saw was saying, yeah, I'm going to defend the fact that you can't get an abortion in Missouri if you're raped or a victim of incest.
Right. I'm
going to defend if a woman is pregnant and there's a fatal fetal abnormality and the fetus is still alive, you have to carry that baby to term. And you want to know why the reason I think there was no defense? Because those are not defensible positions to ordinary people.
They're certainly not popular positions. They're not positions that anything approximating a good chunk of the electorate supports. I mean, that's kind of where we are. The reason this issue is so controversial, in my opinion, and I've always thought this, and I ran for office as a pro-life candidate, and I am a pro-life person. But what's really happening with the abortion issue is you're taking arguably the two foundational cornerstones of the American experience, life and liberty. And in a very real sense, those two cornerstones are pitted against one another uniquely with an issue like abortion. And so the side that's defending abortion rights, they're upholding a value of liberty. It's a fundamental, foundational, cornerstone value of the republic. And I think that's where the inherent conflict exists on the issue at a philosophical level.
I'm talking with John Hancock. He is a Republican political consultant and a former state legislator back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Before we had catalytic converters, I think. It's a long time ago.
We got a lot of listener comments and questions about this phenomenon of voting for things that are perceived as liberal ballot items and Republican candidates. Coral Marina on Instagram says, where I come from, people follow local politics and the news highlight local races. Since living in Missouri, I'm impressed how little following there is on local government. How is it possible there is no local television primetime governor debate or senator debate? Most people probably consume whatever little news is in the preferred channel and flyers they get. Now, just to be clear, there was a U.S. Senate debate on Halloween when most people were trying to trick or treat with their kids. But I do think that Coral is bringing up an important point that, like, the coverage of local politics and, more importantly, people paying attention to local politics has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. What do you think about that?
No question about it. And look at the size. When I started in the legislature, the Capitol Bureau, the press corps that was physically inside the Capitol covering, you had people from the St. Joe News Press in the Capitol every day, reporters from all across the state, radio reporters from many different parts of the state. And that Capitol Press Corps, as we've all seen, has shrunk dramatically. Not to mention the number of local newspapers that go out of business every month in this country and in this state. And those are the folks that pay attention to what's happening at City Hall. I think one of the great struggles we're going to have over the course of the next few decades is with this local attention diminishing. These municipal governments, city governments, county governments are going to receive less scrutiny, and that's not good for the adequate functioning of government.
Tempest Tau Stowed on TikTok says, rural Missourian here. Candidates have an R next to them on ballots, while policies we vote for don't. Some see the R and think, that's my team, regardless. It's hard to do that with policy. Now, I heard a similar anecdote about Northeast Missouri in the 1980s and 90s. When parts of Northeast Missouri were heavily Democratic, if you told people that you were a Republican in, say, Bowling Green, Missouri, you would be like socially ostracized from your friends. Now I think it's the opposite in some parts of rural Missouri, where if you say that you're a liberal Democrat, you could be an outcast given that everybody is Republican. How does that sort of social dynamic come into play when voting specifically for candidates? Yeah, it seems really important here, and we don't talk about it very often.
It definitely comes into play. And, Missouri, in some respects, trailed the southwestern part of the United States in converting its rural areas from Democrat to Republican. That's happened now. And we're now at the cusp of a realignment of the internally within the political parties, the Republican Party becoming less of what I would call a movement conservative party, fiscally conservative, culturally conservative, and becoming much more populist in its approach, in the kind of candidates it promotes, in the kind of candidates who win primaries. And so you're going to see you're seeing shifts in the electorate right now in suburbs, moving away from republicanism to a certain extent, and then the rural areas solidifying a near, not unanimous, but certainly strong, large majority Republican voters.
Ash on TikTok says, Missourians are 3 decades into an identity crisis. They believe in many progressive ideas, but they don't want to associate with progressive people. They want to be the tough guy, bootstrap cowboy. What Ash, I think, is alluding to there is, and this is also something I've heard from both Republicans and Democrats in Northeast Missouri, the National Democratic Party is toxic to a lot of Missourians. And it is seen as much more liberal than how Missourians feel as a whole. So I've always thought national politics play a big role in state elections. How much do you think that has to do with the fact that Democrats have been struggling, especially in the last 10 or 15 years when all these ballot initiatives are passing?
Yeah, a lot of it is in the bucket of what I would call cultural issues, whether that be, gun rights and restrictions, the panoply of issues surrounding LGBTQ. There's a cultural divide in rural America with where Democrat elites are, and Democrat elites have almost ceded the high school educated working class voter to Republicans. And that was one of the defining results of this last presidential election we had. The Democratic Party, for as long as I can remember, was the party of the working class. And that change that's coming about, I think the Democrats have some real soul searching to do in terms of how they're going to present their candidates, the kind of candidates they're going to recruit, the kind of messaging they're going to implement. Because if they didn't learn a lesson in this last election, then I don't know when they're going to learn it.
Missy Grisby on TikTok says, it's ludicrous. They are voting for the people that are trying to take the rights away. It's a cycle, and they will continue to try to take the rights away. Facepalm emoji. And that kind of gets into a point that I kind of brought up when I played the Cindy O'Loughlin clip. One of the reasons why I think a lot of Democrats who follow Missouri politics are confused by this trend is eventually it could be self-defeating. If you continue to elect Republicans, they will eventually dismantle all these ballot initiatives. Now, do I think that they're going to dismantle the sports betting ballot initiative, even though it passed by a far less margin than abortion? No, because there's a lot of money to be made there. And also DraftKings and FanDuel. Was going to say Rosenbets. That was my app that I was going to create. They're going to wield a lot of power over legislators. But is that overblown though? They haven't repealed Medicaid expansion. They haven't repealed the minimum wages. They haven't repealed the minimum wage increases. They haven't repealed legal marijuana. And I'm not convinced they're going to be able to easily undo Amendment 3.
Well, they're not going to be able to repeal it. I do think that there's a lane for reasonable restrictions based around fetal viability that the voters in the state would support if it were on the ballot and done well. The voters of the state aren't going to support a law where there's no exceptions for rape or incest in the abortion law. There's not a majority.
Well, the
to
amendment
support
does
that.
cover it until fetal viability, which has a specific term, and I think that the opponents have pointed to the expanded health, life of the mother, and mental health exception to extrapolate it to saying you can get an abortion at any time. I think that legal experts strongly disagree with that argument. Obviously, judges will end up making the final call on that, but continue.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that will need to be adjudicated, obviously, because mental health is, it seems to me like that's a wide open exception, to allow abortion, but we don't know.
John Hancock is a Republican political consultant. He also is the former executive director of the Missouri Republican Party and a former Missouri House member. John, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Jason.
Today's episode was produced by Jason Rosenbaum.
Audio engineering by Alex Hoyer.
This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.